Support provided by Walters, Papillon, Thomas Collins, LLC.
It is my honor to welcome Judge Adam Haney to Rotary today to share with us essential information on adverse childhood events.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. So let's get started. I'm going to warn everybody that I'm a lawyer and a judge, so that means I talk a lot. I'm going to do my very best to keep this within the time that you guys need. Please feel free. I can see comments. If you guys have a question or a comment on something that if it fits really well with what we're doing, I'll try to address it while we're talking, okay? But let's go ahead and get started. So again, this is Understanding Adverse Childhood Experiences. I am a certified ACEs educator. I was trained by the Louisiana Department of Health to give this presentation specifically. I'm going to let you know before we start out, all of these slides and everything we're going to talk about has been approved by doctors, researchers, and scientists. If at the end anybody has any questions about anything we've talked about, I have all of the citations for everything we're going to talk about today. So I can send you the slides. I can send you the citation so you can see the study for yourself that backs up what we're going to be talking about. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about, just by way of introduction, is the ACE study preliminarily. So we're going to talk more about this later on, but just to start out with, the study was started by Dr. Robert Anda and Vince Felitti. Robert Anda was studying obesity with the Centers for Disease Control at the time of this study. Essentially, what he found through this is that the problems he was addressing can relate specifically back to events in people's childhood. And the specific incident here was he was working with a woman who had lost a ton of weight. And every time she would lose weight, she would gain it all back. And he came to the realization that there's not necessarily a medical cause for this. And so he kind of delved deeper into what was going on with this woman. And essentially what had happened is that she had been sexually assaulted as a child. And in her mind, she would lose weight, and she would feel once she lost that weight that she was more attractive to men. And she didn't want that because she had this unaddressed trauma. And so she would gain it all back to try to make herself unattractive so that she would not re-experience the trauma that she had dealt with as a child. And so that was kind of his big awakening in knowing that what happens to us as children continues to affect us as adults. Vince Felitti is a physician in San Diego, California, and he was doing some of the same population level work. And so that's what that combination resulted in the study. Before we get into the results of the actual study, we're going to have to get into some of the science, and I'll tell you that I'll geek out a little bit on the science. I find this really interesting. What we need to know to start out with is that the human body uses our nervous system to experience the world around us, right? And so what happens is we have nerves on our hands and our feet, our skin, our eyes, our ears, everything. And so what happens is the body takes in what is around us through our nervous system. So our nerves experience what's going on around us. Those sensations travel up the spinal cord to the brain, where the brain processes all of our information. This is happening constantly, all the time. And this is something I think that we all know, but to think about it, I mean, it's just amazing, right? And so what happens is all of these experiences flow through our body to our brain, where our brain processes this information, right? So let's talk about the brain for a second. Our brain is essentially, and the way we process information is through synapses, right? That's the connections in our brain that process these electrical impulses. That's how we experience the world around, how we process how we experience the world around us. So we can talk about this at birth, right? So if you look at that, this is what our synapses look like when we are born, right? And so you'll notice that they're very few. The connections are not great. And if you think about it for a second, it makes sense. Because what do we need to do when we're born, right? What we do when we're born is we eat, we sleep, we cry, we poop, right? That's what we do. When we're born, we do not need to know calculus, right? We don't need to know how to read Shakespeare. We don't need any of that. We got to do those few things in order to stay alive. And so our brain is prepared for that. So if you think about it, that's what's going on with us when we're born, right? And this is really explains the difference between our brain and the rest of our bodies. When we're born, our heart does what it's going to do. It pumps blood, right? So our kidneys filter, our lungs bring in and out oxygen, okay? But our brains are going to continue to develop. So let's look at what happens when we reach elementary age, right? An explosion of these synapses. And that's because our body, our brain, does not know what we're going to be. We have an infinite future and infinite possibilities, right? And so what happens is our brain is prepared for us to learn how to play the violin, play the piano, to learn Chinese, to be an electrical engineer, to learn to play baseball, all of this kind of stuff. So every possible pathway is there. This is a process that's called arborization. So you can see the branching out. And so it's called arborization because you see the tree branches coming. And so the brain is prepared for anything, right? So in everybody, the path where you learn French is there, right? The path where you learn to play the piano is there. But then what happens is that we don't all learn French. We don't all learn to play the piano. And so those pathways, they don't get used, they get pruned away. And so you see that's starting to happen around puberty. And so that's a process that, like arborization is those branches growing, this is called pruning. And so what happens is the pathways that we use are the ones that stick around. And so once we start, the brain development comes through and we start to experience this pruning, that's we're starting to get hardwired. And so you're going to see, you think you can't teach an old dog new tricks. And that saying comes from this, basically, is that our brain wires itself to do certain things. And so that's why we end up with the brain that we end up with. So, and I know I'm moving kind of fast, talking fast, because I want to make sure I get in all the important stuff here. Let's look at this slide, right? And so we're talking about brain development, and we're realizing that our brain develops in response to the things that we experience as children. Okay, that process of arborization and pruning is our brain developing and responding to the things around us and the conditions that are around us. And so if we look at this, and I want to preface this by saying that obviously nobody has an all good or an all bad childhood, right? We all experience things that are good and bad and positive and negative. But I think we can all agree that there are many people in this world that experience much more negative than other people, and some much more positive than other people. And so this is what we're going to talk about for a second. So let's talk about that top path. We call this like the danger path, right? Where a child grows up in a dangerous situation, right? And I want to think for a second, everybody think for a second, and imagine that you are walking through the woods, and you're walking through the woods, you're on a hike, you turn the corner, and there's a bear, right? So you see this bear, and all of a sudden your body is like danger, right? What happens at that moment in time? Well, your body is preparing when you see that bear for that danger. Well, what is your body doing? It is getting ready to either fight harder than you have ever fought before in your life, or to run faster than you have ever run in your entire life, right? So fight or flight. And we've come to understand also that there's a third area really, that's a freeze. And as a former prosecutor and as a judge, I tend to see this more with sexual assault victims, where you will hear that, they were in this terrible situation and they just disassociated and they felt like they were floating above it all, and it wasn't really happening to them. They weren't even there while it was happening. So that's kind of the third stress response. But really here we're talking about fight or flight right now with this bear. So what happens in that moment is your body's getting ready. So at that moment, your body releases stress hormones. And the most common one that we know is adrenaline, right? But there's also cortisol and other stress hormones that prepare the body to do something amazing. So we hear about all the time the mom whose child was trapped underneath a car, right? And somehow she got the strength to lift this car and save her baby. Okay, that really happens. And that happens because the brain floods the body with these stress hormones like cortisol and like adrenaline. So your pupils dilate, right? You get tunnel vision. All of a sudden, the stuff that's not important goes away. right? You don't need to see anything but the threat. You don't need to see anything from that bear. So your peripheral vision limits, right? You don't need to hear anything except for that bear. So your hearing kind of goes away, right? And so what happens is it floods all this. You make the decision to fight or to run. And so you run. And for 20 minutes, you run faster than you have ever run before in your entire life to get away from that bear, right? And so you get away from the bear. And what happens then? All of those stress hormones, after about 20 minutes, the brain sends that signal that says, okay, we don't need this anymore. Flush it, right? And so the brain and the body flush all those stress hormones out of your body. And your body at that moment has done what it's supposed to do. It has focused on the danger. It has gotten you out of the danger, and you have survived. That's one thing that human beings are really good at doing, okay? And hopefully you are never going to have to experience that ever again. You'll never run into a bear. You'll never experience that danger ever again, right? So that's what should happen. But I want you to imagine that instead of that happening one time, imagine that that bear comes home every night, okay? So imagine that that bear comes home, that child is at home, and here's the keys coming through that door, and he knows that dad's coming in, right? And you know what? At that moment, he doesn't know if dad's been drinking or had a terrible day at work. And so he doesn't know if when dad comes in, he's going to have to either go hide or he's going to have to prepare himself to get hit. He doesn't know if he's going to have to stand in the way and try to protect, make a decision where he's going to protect his mom, right, from dad. He doesn't know if maybe mom's coming home and mom's got some mental health issues, and he doesn't know it's a good day or a bad day for mom. And so those stress hormones start to flow through, right? And so every day he gets that adrenaline rush, he gets that cortisol rush, because he is prepared, fight or flight, okay? The body is not designed for that. That's not what we're designed for, right? We're designed to have those hormones, those stress hormones hit us, get us out of that danger moment, and then go away, and then not experience that again. So we're going to learn that those stress hormones have if they are constant, have a serious negative impact on that child. We also know that child becomes conditioned and developed to survive in those bad conditions, right? Because we know that the body adapts. We know that the brain is creating those pathways, right? That person, human being, that young child is going to adapt to survive those conditions, right? And then you have the bottom one, where that child grows up in a safe environment, does not have to experience those terrible things often, right? They're going to be used to and developed to operate in a safe environment, and they're built to survive those best conditions, okay? So then the question becomes we talk about this, those kids who grow up in those worst conditions grow up to be someone who is edgy, hypervigilant, quick to act. And so, we look, and those people are people that we think would do well in stressful environments. So we always talk about emergency room doctors, right? Firefighters can be soldiers. I always get police officers in this, but I remind them that sometimes we want our police officers to be edgy, hypervigilant, and sometimes we don't. I think that's a thing that the country right now is wrestling with, oftentimes with law enforcement. So we need to be careful about that. But we also need to recognize that what happens in childhood bleeds over into this area. So this is the big thing right here. It's when those adaptations run into our societal expectations that we run into trouble, right? And so let's take that child that grew up in that tough environment, that has lived with those stress hormones, and is always prepared for the worst thing, right? So I'm gonna go back to this slide real quick and tell you that in connection with those two things is one of the men that trained me in this, that taught my class, is a former soldier. He served 4 tours in Iraq, and he also grew up in that tough environment, the dangerous environment growing up. And so the very interesting thing, one of the interesting things that he said is that when he was at home, he was always on edge, always worried, was never calm. But when he was in Iraq, he could be calm at that point. And the reason is that he knew where the danger was, right? It's those guys over there that are shooting at me. That's where the danger is. So every other moment he could be calm because he knew where to look and where to be worried. But when he was back at home in an area that should be calm and clear and smooth, he had trouble because he was always on the lookout for danger and didn't know where it was coming from. So let's talk about what that looks like if you grew up in that environment and you have that issue where you were looking for danger. Where's the danger coming from? Let's take that child who grew up in that environment and let's put them in school, right? What do we want our children to do in school? What do we expect of them, right? And obviously, some are in school, some are virtual right now. But when they're in school, what do we expect, right? We expect those kids to sit down, to be quiet, to share, right? To not hurt other kids or act out at other kids. That's what we expect. And so what we've got is you have a group of children that have grown up in this dangerous environment that are primed and ready to see danger. And because they know that it's out there, because that's where they've grown up in. That's what they've grown up in. They've grown up in an environment where they don't know when they're going to eat next, right? So maybe they've grown up where every time the authority figure, mom or dad, tells them, no, you can't do something, it's accompanied with a hit, right? A slap across the face or a punch, right? Or they've grown up in an environment with severe emotional abuse where they're constantly getting yelled at or anything like that. And then we expect those kids to come into school, right? And we expect that kid that maybe is not sure when they're going to eat next. We expect them to share, right? When all they've ever known is that I need to hold on to this because I may never see it again. And then what happens when that child does not want to share? Is they get in trouble, right? Or let's think about that child always is confronted with the adult in their life is violent towards them. And so that teacher, who should be a calm and safe person, and we all know that, but that child doesn't know that. That teacher says, no, you can't do that. And then we wonder, oh my goodness, why is this child having this outsized reaction? All I told him was that, no, you can't sit in that chair, or no, you can't play with that toy right now, right? And that child has this outsized reaction where they start screaming and yelling, right? And they fly into a rage. Well, what's really happening there is their body has conditioned them to adapt to, this authority figure has told me no, it told me I can't do this. My body knows that most of the time, this now is accompanied with some kind of physical violence or some kind of consequence. And so they're flood with those stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, all of this. And so their body gets into fight or flight. And they react. They get that tunnel vision. They say, this is danger. I have to get out of this danger. And they react to that. And so then we sit here and we wonder in school, why is this happening? Well, we're coming to learn this is why. Is because they have adapted to a dangerous situation, a dangerous life scenario, but we are now putting them into a safe one, and we expect them to act differently than they have been conditioned to act their entire lives so far, right? And so now that's why we end up having these kids having outsized reactions, and then we respond in a way that is not appropriate to their adaptations. All right, excuse me. Now, we know that this is happening, and we know that these stress periods have significant impacts on these kids. What we have come to learn is that the times when certain abuse or neglect happens will affect certain things. And that makes sense because our brain doesn't just develop all at once. Our brain develops as it's needed. And so, when you're a child, some of the higher level thinking stuff is not there because your brain you don't need it yet, right? And so certain types of abuse and neglect that happen at certain ages in certain children will have different kinds of impacts, which can be part of the reason why, someone will say, oh, well, look, I experienced this bad thing and I'm fine, right? Well, this other person experienced this bad thing and they're having all types of consequences. And a large part of that is because our brains are all developing differently at different times. Not only to the fact that everybody's different and we're all going to respond to things differently. So if you think about it and you want to look at this, that some of the important stuff is that sexual abuse for a girl, right, will have effects differently at different ages, and sexual abuse of a boy will have effects differently at different ages. It's very interesting, and this is something we're really just getting, to learn, is exactly how all this works like this. And so just know that the times that some of these negative things happen will have serious impacts on what the consequences are later. So a couple of really important things here that we know, right? We know that the amygdala and hippocampus are super important for how we process fear and emotion and relationships, and that this is part of the limbic system of the brain. And so what you have, and I'm just going to kind of really briefly talk about this, is we'll look at this. The amygdala is it's like the smoke detector. Okay, the amygdala is the danger center, the danger alarm in your brain, right? The hippocampus is where we process that alarm. So we use our memories and past experience to process that danger. Okay, and we look at it like this: the smoke alarm goes off, right? And so all of a sudden, if you're at home, smoke alarm goes off, you tense up. Okay, that's not a good thing. What's going on? Your hippocampus then comes in and says, oh, well, what's going on is that every time somebody takes a shower and they kind of leave the door cracked a little bit, the steam comes out and sets off the smoke alarm. And I know that my wife just went to take a shower. And so all of a sudden you calm down, right? Say, okay, I do not need to be super stressed about this. Well, what happens is that the amygdala and the hippocampus are not fully formed when we're born. And we know that stress hormones, right, particularly large amounts of stress hormones through childhood, can affect how they develop, or if they develop at all. If you have too much stress at too young an age, you can end up in a situation where those areas do not develop, period, where you end up with essentially no amygdala, no hippocampus. And so what that does is that affects your smoke alarm going off and then how you process it. So for some people, they don't process danger, right? And so you can think of this, and some people who don't see danger and their alarms don't go up, and they end up being victimized because they didn't see the danger that other people are like, how could you do that? How could you not see that? And that could be because their amygdala and hippocampus are not functioning correctly. I also want you to think about, imagine that your smoke alarm goes off, but your hippocampus is not capable of saying, hey, calm down. This is not really an emergency or not really danger, right? So all of a sudden, think about, you're in that situation, you're nervous or stressed for some reason, right? And you're sensing some kind of danger. And that could be that teacher is telling you, no, don't do that. You can't do that, right? Well, for all of us, we may get our stress hormones up, but our hippocampus is telling us, listen, she's safe. Nothing bad has ever happened here. You can calm down because you know what? Tomorrow you'll get a chance to do whatever it is that you want to do. So no reason to get stressed out about it. But if your hippocampus is not functioning correctly, that danger comes, that smoke alarm is going off, and you're reacting to that alarm. And there's nothing to tell you, no, this is not danger, no, this is not danger. So every time your hippocampus goes off, every time that smoke alarm goes off, you react like it's a fire and your house is about to burn down and everybody's going to die, right? Imagine being a child or an adult who has to function like that. And now all of a sudden, for me, when I learned this information, the reactions of some of the kids I deal with started to make a little bit of sense, right? Is some of those outsized reactions, you're looking at it like, why on earth are you acting like this? How are you responding to this? This is not a big deal. Well, once you start to realize, and especially once you learn some of the trauma that some of these children have gone through, this starts to make some sense. It's because their smoke detector and the way they process that smoke detector are not in line. And so all of a sudden, danger, they don't process danger like we process danger. Okay. So again, this is where we're talking about this. And just to give you some examples here, that the way this goes is the trauma can affect, certain things. It's very interesting because it will even affect visual processing, how we hear things, our auditory, the way our brain processes hearing. If we have trauma at certain areas, it can affect our hearing. If we have trauma at certain times when the visual stuff is being developed, and the way our brain processes our vision, right? We will all of a sudden not see things the way that other people see things. Like some of the tests are peripheral vision, right? If you have too much stress at certain times, those people will have less peripheral vision than other people who did not experience that stress. And it's not because there's something wrong with their eyes. It's because of the way that our brain processes that information was affected. So it's really crazy that this is childhood trauma, and the things that are happening to us as children literally affect the way that we see the world. And so it's absolutely crazy. So some of the last things that develop in our prefrontal cortex, right? And so if you're a lawyer or have been paying attention to some things that, how we deal with juveniles, and particularly juveniles who've been charged as adult, some of the big momentum is saying that, look, your brain is not fully developed, right? And so that's absolutely true that our brain is not fully developed. I don't take a position, the legal side, about how we should handle that. This is just the knowledge of what's going on. And so the prefrontal cortex is the last thing. That's the part that's right here in the front, right behind your forehead. It's responsible for a lot of most of your executive functioning. And so I talk to kids. I say, this is the brain. This is the brakes on your brain, right? And so, which is why we see some crazy things with kids, is because their brakes don't work and they're not fully developed. And it's why once you hit to 25, 30, you see a lot less of the really crazy stuff with people that you really just don't understand, because the brakes on those adults are starting to work to say, hey, whoa, don't do this. This doesn't make any sense. And so it's also, though, why you see that trauma affects that the most, because it's the last thing to develop. And it's those pathways. If those pathways and those synapses don't get developed correctly, you're really affecting your higher functioning and how you really process the world. And this is so super important for how we go in the workplace, in school, for our relationships, right? It's very difficult if this executive functioning is not developed properly. It's really hard to have good relationships. It's really hard to function well in a structured environment at work or at school, right? This is all the stuff that's on the screen that's important for that. And so that childhood trauma, which is affecting the brain development, will affect this the most, okay? And this is the part, if you're an employer, this is the stuff that's super important for your employees to have. If you're a teacher or you're a parent of a child in school, this is what is going to make or break them in being really successful or not in school. Think about your partner, right? Your spouse. This is the stuff that's super important in order for them to be successful in that relationship, okay? So all of the stuff that we expect and that we want for you to be successful, this is where it is, right? And we know that childhood trauma and brain development affects this the most. So now that we know this, right, we got to choose what we're going to do about it. We have to choose how we're going to address these. And I think that's important, particularly once we get into the study, the ACE study itself coming up next, and we get into what's our response to this. We have to decide how we're going to address people who have these issues, right? And I can tell you right now that I would imagine that some people that are on this call are thinking about their childhood right now, and then thinking about some of the things that they do, and they're saying, maybe something that I've done in the past, or like a choices that I've made and I didn't really understand why, right? Maybe it makes a little sense. Maybe you have employees who react certain ways to certain things, and this is an eye opener here. I will tell you, as an employer now, this is some of the stuff that I think about that has affected the way that I deal with and address my employees. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's get into the ACE study, right? ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And super important, super interesting here. It's important for you to know before we get going, like who this study is of. So what happened is that when this study started, it's essentially 17,000 people who were involved, Kaiser Permanente, which is a health system in California, right? So we're talking about them. These are all people we need to understand is they all have health insurance, right? This is where all these records came from. So what does that mean about them? That means that they are all middle, upper class people, right? The majority of these 17,000 in California are also white, okay? So we're talking about a population that if I gave you, I said, this is 17,000 white, middle, and upper class people, immediately you are forming an image in your head. And I guarantee that that image does not involve them being abused or neglected in childhood, right? So what we learn from that is when we get into the numbers, we're going to learn that these adverse childhood experiences are actually very common across race, across income, right? This stuff affects everybody, okay? So let's talk about what an ACE is, right? This study covered 10 adverse childhood experiences that they identified. And part of what makes this study a little bit different is there had been things previously that addressed what happens to people who are sexually abused as children. What if they, experienced physical abuse as a child or neglect as a child? But there were all these individual studies and nobody ever put it all together. And so this was the first study to go across these adverse childhood experiences. I'm going to tell you right now that there's more than 10. Okay, the study covers 10, but there are other things that can cause trauma for children. These are the most common. This is what they study. And so to start off with, for your ACEs, what they're looking at is they said if you experienced one of these 10 things one time, you get a score of 1, right? So it's not if your parent, if you experience physical abuse because a parent was physically abusive to you, you don't count it. It happened 10 times, and so you get a score of 10. It happened to you, you get a score of 1. So what we learned is that 27% of those 17,000 had experienced a parent or guardian that had substance abuse. 23% experienced parental separation or divorce. 17% mental illness. 13% a battered mother. 6% had a caregiver or guardian, a parent, be arrested, and so that was the criminal behavior there. 15% emotional abuse. 10% physical abuse or neglect. 11% emotional abuse, 28% physical abuse, 21% sexual abuse, right? And so that totals up to 10. We also know now that ACEs are common and that they tend to be clumped together, okay? So what we know about those 17,000 is 33% of them had 0 ACEs. 26% had 1, 16% had 2, 10% had 3, 16% had experienced 4 or more of these things before they turned the age of 18. Okay? So, what else do we know about this now? Is we know that ACEs have a dose-response relationship to consequences. All right? So basically what that means is the more ACEs you have, the more likely you are to have those consequences going forward. Okay, and so when we talk about health problems, we're going to talk about that more in a second, but we're talking about mental health and physical health. So here we go, right? This is what we know, is that we know that if you have 4 or more ACEs, right, that of those people with 4 or more, 13% had started smoking by the time they were 12 years old, right? Compared to 4% with 0 ACEs, right? So if you look at 4 or more ACEs, was, I believe, 17% were currently smoking versus 7% that with 0 ACEs that were currently smoking. And with that comes COPD. So obviously, the more people that smoke, the more people that are going to have those health consequences with smoking. And so if you think about it, why are they smoking, right? It is a stress reliever. So if you've gone through all this, had all this trauma in your life, you're probably stressed out. I found this one to be super interesting, right? It makes sense to me conceptually that if you have a lot of ACEs or these adverse childhood experiences, that you are more likely to have a substance use problem or be an alcoholic, right? And so, and you can see it there, is that you're talking about 16% of those people with 4 more ACEs would be considered an alcoholic. The next one, though, is crazy to me. It took me a second to figure it out, because 34% of people with 4 more ACEs, right, are married to an alcoholic. And so think about all the problems that come with being married to an alcoholic. You're talking about domestic abuse. You're talking about, obviously, if you're alcoholic, you're more likely to be in poverty, right? To deal with all of those consequences of having somebody, being married to somebody who's an alcoholic. Why on earth would that be? Why would you be more likely to be married to an alcoholic? And I really think it comes down to that's what you're used to, right? If you are constantly looking for the danger and wondering where the danger is coming from, you're going to be more comfortable with somebody who's an alcoholic because you know where the problem is, right? And it's also more likely that you grew up in that chaotic environment. And frankly, you're more comfortable in that chaotic environment because you know where the danger is than you would be in a calm environment where you're constantly looking for the danger. And so it's one of those secondary effects that you don't think about. But this is, if you think, it is absolutely crazy that what happened to us as children has this ongoing impact that leads someone to be married or partnered with someone who causes all of these problems, right? And that's all relates back to abuse, neglect that happened to somebody as a child. This makes sense to me, obviously. 4 more ACEs, 60% of women who reported having 4 more ACEs were also clinically depressed, diagnosed depressed, right? Versus 19% who had 0 ACEs. And if you look at the men, it also tracks up. Now you have 39% of men with 4 more ACEs. I'll be honest with you, I don't think that men are less depressed than women. I think that men don't report it. I think that the numbers should probably be about equal. But regardless, you can see that dose-response relationship, right? That dose-response relationship showing that the more ACEs you have, the more likely you are to be depressed. These are all examples of ACE attributable problems. If you get into the literature, all of the studies, everything says that each one of these things is associated with ACEs. The more ACEs you have, the more likely you are to experience one of these things. Alcoholism, lung disease, heart disease, depression, drug abuse, have a child, fetal death, be a victim of domestic violence, liver disease, have mental health problems, obesity, sexual behavior problems, smoking, unintended pregnancy, violence, workplace problems. Every single one of these things comes back to what happened to us as children, right? This is crazy. This is absolutely crazy that all of these serious problems that are affecting adults, right, can be traced back to what happened to us as children. You're talking about people that are 70, 80 years old that are having physical responses to stuff that happened to them when they were 6, right? This is so eye-opening to me that what happens to us as children during these sensitive times of development have lifelong consequences. So, and David, I see your question, and we're gonna be getting to that. That's the question of what are the prospects of teaching old dog new tricks and changing some of those neural pathways, right? Well, we're gonna get to that in a minute. So what we do know is that there are high ACE scores throughout the population, right? Is that these are all over the place. We also know that if you have high ACE scores, they are associated with increased risks of multiple health and social problems. And we also know that there is intergenerational transmission of ACEs. And what that means is that if you had a lot of ACEs as a child, you're more likely to have a child that has a lot of ACEs, right? And it makes sense. And I really see that as a judge in juvenile court. What I see is parents parent their children the way that they were parented. So if they had these ACEs and they had tough childhoods, it's very likely that they're going to transmit that to their children. There's also a theory, epigenetics, which is interesting, and I'm still not 100% sure how much I buy it, but it talks about that it's almost these traumas are imprinted on our DNA. And so the trauma that occurred generations past becomes imprinted on our DNA and passed down to us. There's an interesting study involving rats where they took rats and the adult rats, and they would pump the smell of cherry blossoms into their cage. And when they would pump that smell in, they would then give the rats an electric shock. So the rats very quickly associated that smell with the electric shock. Then they took these rats. The rats had pups. and they immediately took the pups away from those rats that had experienced the cherry blossom and the shock, put them with other rats who had not experienced that. So these pups had never experienced the cherry blossoms and the electric shock. Okay, they were raised by rats that had never experienced the cherry blossoms and the shock. When they would pump that cherry blossom smell into the cage with those baby rats who had never smelled it before, those rats recoiled like they were going to get a shock because they thought it was coming. They had never experienced that before, but it was passed down through the genetics from their parents to be afraid of that. And it which is crazy. It's absolutely crazy, but it goes to show that what happens to us happens to our children, right? And so if you think about it, and some of you may know this, that when a woman is born, she is born with all of the eggs that she is ever going to have, right? So that comes with that. So what you end up with is if that person is abused while the parents abused while that child is in utero, right? That development, that stress is imprinting on that child. And what that means is that then all those eggs are formed. And so that stress and all of that trauma is then imprinted on the baby's eggs. So we're talking 3 generations later is being affected by that trauma. And it's absolutely, it just goes to show how important this is and how impactful childhood trauma is on the rest of our lives, and not only our lives, but the generations that come after us. So I like these 2 slides. I think are some of my favorite slides because they're super interesting. This goes to show, and the way I like to describe it is the amount of these bad things that would go away if we got rid of all ACEs. So if you look at it, and you can look at it like this, alcohol use and binge drinking, 32.5% of that is attributable to ACEs. If we got rid of childhood trauma, 32% goes away. 54% of all marijuana use goes away. 55% of anxiety, people that have that anxiety, goes away. 52% of disability interrupted days goes away. So for all of you employers out there, if we effectively address childhood trauma, your employees can go to work and they don't miss work, right? Suicide, 67% of suicides are attributable to ACEs and all the things that come with it. If we got rid of childhood trauma, 67% of suicides go away. Asthma, 22% of asthma goes away, right? Drinking and driving in the past 30 days, 45% goes away, right? More than 3 falls that require treatment in a hospital, 22% of that goes away, right? High risk for HIV, smoking, asthma, diabetes, 15% of diabetes goes away, right? 65% alcoholism goes away if we can address childhood trauma effectively, right? Diabetes. So this is what we're talking about right here. The cost to Louisiana, $4.2 billion, right? And then 1.3 in indirect costs. So let's talk about that. 15% of 4.2 billion is $630 million, right? I know, Franklin, you were on here. What would you do to have an extra $630 million in the budget, right? But this is what we're talking about. So even if we get past the individual personal effects on people, this has effects on everybody, even if you don't have ACEs, right? Because your whole world is affected by other people, all right? If you're a boss, you're going to deal with your employees, and your employees are dealing with this, right? As taxpayers, fellow citizens are dealing with this, right? So I'm getting the alarm here to get going. Let me address a couple other things here. The question that becomes then is what do we do with this stuff? We have this information. What do we do? I always like to show this slide because this is something that I use in my own house now. This comes from a school in Walla Walla, Washington. It's basically the principal got tired of suspending kids, right? And so what he did was he created this chart. And so when an incident would happen at school, he would say, hey, if you're green, we're going to deal with this right now. If you're yellow, we're going to wait an hour. I'm going to put you in a room with a counselor. You're going to do your schoolwork away from everybody else. We'll address it in an hour. Or if you're red, we're going to address it tomorrow. The kids always get to address it, okay? But they decide when they're going to do it. By implementing this process right here, he reduced suspensions in his school by 80%. As a teacher, obviously, you can't teach kids if they're not in school. But he addressed this, dropped suspensions by 80% by just waiting for the kids to calm down, let their stress hormones release, let them process what's going on, and then deal with the behavior problem. This is something that, we can deal with this at home or with my kids. Are you ready to talk about this or not? If not, you can go calm down somewhere, then we'll address it. Okay. Last things here is TBRI. I would encourage everybody to look at TBRI, trust-based relational interventions. This is something that we are doing here in Louisiana. This is a response to this information and how we address trauma in these children. So Crossroads NOLA is doing TBRI Fridays. And so you can reach out to Crossroads NOLA and you can sign up to take these classes to learn more about how to address it. All right. That's it. So I will let you guys, I think we have some questions here. So, hey, guy, you got some questions for me?
Yeah.
I did pretty good. I'm going to congratulate myself on blasting through this in 50 minutes.
Judge, this has absolutely been amazing. I'm in the comment sections have been really on point. Everyone has really loved this. So thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Chris Delia asked, he says, it's the most heartening to see a judge take such a deep interest in the science of the brain. Are other judges in the East Baton Rouge area following your lead?
So we do have Judge Gail Grover is here. It's my cohort here in East Baton Rouge, and she is involved in this. I will tell you that as far as across the state, Parish is way ahead. They're way ahead of us. Caddo has become really trauma informed. They got a lot of really cool stuff going on up there. There's some stuff going on in Alexandria and New Orleans as well. So this is becoming across. I will tell you, it's mainly with the judges who deal with kids. That's who's doing it. But there is a push where we are trying to push this to the general jurisdiction judges as well.
Awesome. So Pam Wall says Massachusetts has promoted an understanding of youth trauma throughout the state. And how is East Baton Rouge Parish embracing not just awareness, but research-based strategies to help mitigate the child trauma, keeping kids in school and providing interventions?
So these are conversations that I've had with folks at the school board. I know myself and other people have given this presentation. A number of the school-based counselors were in the training with me when we got trained on this. So this is something that is known. I will tell you, getting the principals on board, right, is a little bit more difficult. And I'll be honest with you, I can use my own example here. If you came to my court, there's a pretty good chance that at some point during the time you were there watching, you would see a kid kind of talk to me or act in a way that you would say, that's not appropriate. And I can't believe the judge is letting that kid talk to him like this, right? What I've had to do is understand, and through this is very helpful when you have this knowledge, is that this kid's reaction is not really about me. It's a lot about what this kid has gone through and how they're processing what's happening to them. And so I have to let my ego go. And if you've ever met a lawyer or a judge, you know that can be difficult, right? But it's the same thing with principals, right? Is that principals tend to be, they're very order. You have to be respected. You can't let a kid talk to him like this. I have to maintain order in the school. And so a lot of it is you got to let that go and figure out how you make that work. And that's what I think is so impressive about that principal in Walla Walla, is that's part of when he talks about what he did was, it's a lot about, I got to let my ego go. Yeah, this kid talked to me like this, but it's not really about me. It's about what this kid has experienced and what's going on in their lives. So we got to let them go. And so I will be honest with you, in dealing with on the discipline side, some of the more difficult stuff is getting teachers and principals on board with understanding that we got to address these underlying causes. It's not about you. You got to let some of the ego go so that we can really address what's going on.
Another question, this is from Phyllis Mouton. She says, my 91 diverse member professional women's organization will hear a presentation by ULL on ACEs at the end of October. and they want to invite some district judges. What is the best way for our group to help spread the word and participate further in this kind of research?
Well, for me, it's important. We're still, look, here in Louisiana, we're still on the preliminary side of getting this information out, unfortunately. So the main thing is myself, and there are plenty of ACEs educators out there. If you reach out to me, you can reach out to me directly. I'll connect you. I will present anywhere, anytime to anybody on this because I think it's very important. And so there's lots of us that will do that. That to me, that's the first thing that's most important is getting this information out there. I'm also participating in a couple of weeks in a training on TBRI. And so this will be the first time that the Care and Purpose Institute at TCU, they created TBRI, which is kind of the response to this, how to deal with kids with trauma. It's leading evidence-based. They are actually they were coming to Louisiana pre-pandemic to actually put this training on. First time they left Texas to do it. And so we're going to participate virtually now. So there's going to be a large group in Louisiana who is ready to go on the road, and we're going to be train the trainers people. So we'll be able to put on trainings on how to do TBRI and to get more people involved in that. And that's the next step, and that's the response. And so hopefully, within the next year, the beginning of next year, we'll be ready to really go out and push more of this out there.
So I have a question for you. Are there organizations in the greater Baton Rouge area that are taking advantage of the ACEs training right now, other than just your court?
Absolutely. I mean, we've given this there. The ACEs, like the school, lots of folks at the schools have. The hospitals are doing this, are really addressing this. Any place that deals with kids are really, have kind of reached out. There's a recognition across, everywhere that this is important. So we've engaged the YMCA, Big Buddy, all of those folks that put on camps and do enrichment stuff for kids are getting involved in this. And the next step is really to get the wider population to understand why this is important. Because look, I'll be honest with you, if the state of Louisiana took this as a priority and said, look, we're going to actually invest in kids and we're going to invest in this is going to have a payoff down the road, right? And, my thing is this, look, in Louisiana, this is how we deal with this like car maintenance, okay? And if you want to, if you maintain your car, you get the oil changed regularly, you change the timing bolt, you get all the scheduled maintenance, right? At the end of the day, your car is going to last 250,000 miles and you can get your money's worth on the car. Or you can ignore all that, right? And you don't have to pay any money right now on scheduled maintenance. But guess what? In 3 years, you're spending $30,000 on a new car. And in the state of Louisiana, that's what we do, right? We defer all our maintenance and we end up paying a lot more down the road. And
that's a great analogy.
This is why it's dumb, right? And I say this as this, but that's what we do. It's because there's this implication or idea that what's happened to these kids doesn't necessarily have that kind of impact. And we don't want to pay the money now. Look, I hate paying taxes. I don't pay more taxes, right? But I also understand that we end up paying more taxes and all the way down because we don't address the problem. And we can address the problem. Just honestly, we don't have the will to do it. And that's the problem. That's why I think the more people learn about this, the more they will understand this is important. We can have an impact. We just have to step up and do it.
Judge, cannot thank you enough. It's been a fascinating presentation today. Really, really, I've learned a lot. I'm a social worker, so I really enjoyed your presentation today. Absolutely wonderful. And would love to have you come whenever we can get back to having regular meetings, have you come join Rotary, or at least come to a meeting too.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you again, Judge.
Support provided by Walters, Papillon, Thomas Collins, LLC,